Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. If you work in research long enough, you will eventually have an experience that goes like this. You think, my God, we really need someone to write about topic X. And then you later find out, bang-o, someone is writing about topic X. This has happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to you. And I've touched on the phenomenon briefly in previous episodes of this podcast. But let me tell you a little story here that I think sets up our guest for this week very nicely. I was writing part of The Innovation Delusion, my book with Andy Russell, and I was writing about the history of maintenance. You see, if you start thinking through the lens of how people use technologies, which is how I learned to put it after reading David Edgerton's great work, if you start thinking about use, which includes things like maintenance, repair, you start thinking about what we call work or labor. So then, as a historian of maintenance, you start wondering, how can I get at the maintenance work histories of earlier technological systems? Well, there's some stuff on the history of railroad maintainers, and I was able to do some of my own original research on that topic, looking, for example, at conference proceedings of railroad track maintainers' societies. But what about the electricity system? Things like the linemen. My buddy, historian Patrick McCrae, and I would talk about how Glenn Campbell's Wichita lineman was a kind of maintenance anthem. But also, what about electricians? And all of the work that went into constructing, running, and maintaining electrical utilities. Precious little has been written about these topics. We know so little about the work that went on around large technological systems, and that's at least in part because the history of technology has not always interfaced well or deeply with labor history, as historian Phil Scranton noted in 1988. So I would be doing this book research and notice that there were great topics that we need stuff on, but do not have. And I would get sad, maybe even a little morose. And I would say, c'est la vie. Oh, life. You dog, you. Fast forward a handful of years. It's January 19th, 2024. I'm going through my morning routine, jacking into email while sitting in my campus office, and a bolt of lightning goes right through my body. I get a message from the Hagley Museum and Library announcing a talk called Power Up, A Social History of American Electricity by Trish Kahle, an assistant professor of history at Georgetown University-Qatar. And here are the first few sentences of the talk abstract. I quote, "The history of American electricity is often told through the experiences of engineers and managers, but these were only a handful of the many thousands of workers who built, maintained, and ran electrical utility systems in the United States. The linemen, clerks, pipe fitters, marketers, secretaries, and many, many others who do the work to keep the power on have little space in the literature. In fact, we have collectively learned not to see these workers and the work that they do, even when they are right in front of our eyes." End quote. And my soul sang a hymn. And the first words of the hymn are, hell yeah, let's go. So that's my little story. And even with a happy ending, or maybe better yet, without an ending, with a happy beginning and a lot of promise. And that's really how all the best stories about scholarship unfold, in which an interesting thinker brings a new perspective to the continuing conversation in any given field. And Trish is a really interesting thinker who has just gotten started on the electricity project, but has another book coming out this fall titled Energy Citizenship, Coal and Democracy in the American Century. Good beginnings! Trish and I talk about both of these projects and reflect more generally on interesting developments of the field sometimes called the energy humanities. I had a great time talking to Trish, who I think is taking a fascinating and smart approach to thinking about the labor dimensions of energy history. I am super stoked about it, and that's why I say to you truly, hey, Get excited! Trish, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Why don't we just start with this new project you got going on the history of the electrical industry? I first saw it, I'm kind of like the Hagley Museum and, program, as I have deep connections to that place, but I also just keep track of what they're up to. And I saw that you were giving us talk about this new project you're doing, and it just sounded like exactly like what I wanted in my life for years now. So I'm stoked. So please lay it on us. Tell us what you're calling it and what you're getting up to.
Yeah, so what I'm calling it is a constantly changing thing.
Yeah.
I actually just changed the title this morning.
Cool.
So I think the new title is Power Out of Sight in Search of the Grid's Human History.
Cool.
And for me, one of the big motivations to work on this, I think like a lot of people, right, their second project comes out of a question from the first book.
Yeah.
And sort of recognizing the importance of utilities as actors. And I got super interested in the utilities and because I'm a labor historian, I went looking for workers. And I was I was very surprised that I couldn't find very much written about them. Because for me, they were everywhere, right? Like every community, there are people working on the grid in some way, in some form. And so I became obsessed with this idea of like, how is the grid working and who is working on it? And as I was doing that, I also became increasingly convinced that to really understand what we were looking at, we had to sort of strip away some of the economic language we use to talk about electric power. So a lot of the language we use to talk about our interaction with the grid is often framed in terms of exchanges, right? So like economic exchange, when that doesn't really describe how a grid actually works, right? It doesn't describe how an electric power system actually works and how we interact with it. So I said, when you strip all of that away and you look at what people actually do and how they actually interact with it, what does it look like and what are the boundaries of that system and who is involved and who is working on it, right? And so not just sort of taking for granted that looking at wages or looking at particular workplaces was going to give me the full story that I wanted. I had to look a little bit wider. And so I started doing that, and I was using the Hagley collections to look at one system in eastern Pennsylvania. But very quickly, it became very clear to me that telling the story of one system was not going to be sufficient to sort of get at the complexities of this history, both because of histories of Jim Crow, of colonialism. These things were very much, temporally, they overlapped with the electrification of the United States.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I need to go to the locations that will give me the story. And as I've been digging and trying to find I found these amazing stories, right, of, workers suing companies, of, particular forms of labor discipline that have been emerging. And I think even most shockingly, one of my favorite discoveries was looking through hundreds and hundreds of pages of payroll and seeing just like one little place where someone had taped a new piece over everyone's wage rates, where they'd gotten a raise in the middle of the week. So it had been entered one way and then changed and entered another. And going back through, I was able to see sort of these long patterns of resistance, defiance, and negotiation between management and the workforce that really just aren't visible in the stories we have about electric power, which really tend to focus on managers, engineers, and sort of company men.
Yeah. No, it's wonderful. Do we have like a good history of electrical unions yet? I mean, maybe there is from the labor history side, but is it? Where are we at with this? Yeah.
So I had this great conversation. I was at the Hagley one day, and I was, they have this great collection. They have every book that's been written on this kind of thing. And I was like, I can't find anything when I'm searching the catalog. I'm going to physically go down to the stacks, and I'm just going to walk up and down because it has to be there. It has to. And a few hours later, I came up and I had to say to Roger Horowitz, I was like, is it true that there's not a single book?
Roger's the guy to ask. He is the guy to ask on this.
And he pointed and he noticed he highlighted something that I had seen, that there are histories of electrical workers unions, but they are primarily electrical workers in factories, right? So people who are building radios, who are building implements,
Right.
right? And those are also people in electrical workers unions. Electrical utility workers, I have not actually found a single thing we would consider a typical labor history of an electric utility that isn't also written by the union itself, which obviously those are very valuable and important, but they're different than the kind of academic history you would expect to see of a topic that is that important.
Yeah, totally. My God, it's this stuff. I love this stuff so much. All right. How about like one thing I wrote about this briefly in the Innovation Delusion with Andy Russell. I think one thing that's really fascinated me is like the linguistic shift around what electrician meant. So like an electrician initially meant probably something more like electrical engineer. And it was like a high status job in the late 19th and early 20th century. And then somehow over time it becomes more of like a trade. Have you seen stuff like that pop up in in what you're looking at all yet?
So I haven't, but I think it gets at one of the really big challenges of trying to reconstruct this from the archives, right? Is that the meanings of things are changing over time. I mean, I think one of the perplexing things I find from that early 20th century period is you have people who are basically building something they've never seen.
Yes, right.
Right. And like, so I mean, like, even that idea of like, obviously electricity has been around, people have been using it in telegraphs and things like this, but like designing and building out a system that like there's nothing really analogous to.
Right.
And so I remember when you were saying that, I thought of this one guy who is listed as an electrician, but he is not, he's definite. Well, I mean, I take this back, right? Like the work he's actually doing is that he's going around and wiring everyone's houses, but like no one's telling him how to do this, right? He has to have a pretty sophisticated understanding of what he's doing and how he's setting this up. So maybe he's one of these sort of like boundary cases. But yeah, I think like the categories issue is a huge one, particularly for like a longue durée part. And also sort of issues of de-skilling and sort of when engineering work is also sort of being pushed further into the office and less into the field.
Yeah. I mean, that's fascinating too. I mean, just to look at that kind of division over time, I'm sure it grows greatly. Because originally, even the engineers would have been, I think, for the like interacting with workers a lot, and when you're first building up the system, The other thing is like, are you really are you going to focus it around utilities, or are you also interested in like, I don't know, like the kind of electrical firms that like work like build buildings and stuff? I mean, there's like trade unionization around those kinds of, or even people who come and fix things in your house or switch out your box, right? So like, how are you kind of bounding it organizationally?
So I have focused on, again, the utilities first, again, because there are more histories of electrical work, both in factories and again, as trade, I think, right? Tradespeople. However, I think there's something distinct about the utilities. First is that the unions clearly recognize this as a distinction. And so like a really good example of this is like ComEd in New York City. ComEd. It's ComEd in Chicago. ComEd.
Yeah. I'm from near Chicago, so I get this confused
too. Freudian slip. So they have, they divide their locals into like A and B locals that sort of are designated by what kind of work people are doing. And the utility workers are definitely lower status jobs.
Yeah.
And so that's like, I think the first key is that there's a sort of recognition of this distinction among the people doing the work themselves. And then I was interested in this because one of my, again, sort of underlying motivations is very presentist. And it's that we are at a moment where people are deciding, how do we decarbonize an energy system, right? How do you make an energy system sustainable? Ideally, how do you also make it more just? But we don't really have a good understanding of its history or where it came from or sort of how, and like, so in particular, I was thinking about things like job classification. So you think about like ideas of just transition and the kinds of people who will be required to build out new kinds of grid. Well, one of those people would be line workers. But line worker is a job that has a very fraught history, right? Both of racial exclusion, of, sort of being separated from other kinds of utility work. So I wanted to be able to do a critical history of the kinds of work that make that electric grid function. And the boundary of where I start and stop that does kind of feel a little bit arbitrary, and I'm still early enough on in the process that could change.
Yeah.
But I've been trying to look at people who are in some way directly interacting with the utility companies, either as a waged employee or in some way that they have some kind of direct interaction with them.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, not every project has to be everything, and you're already going to have a lot to chew on with that boundary, I think. So that's interesting. So in this project, do you want to bring it right up to the present then? I mean, are you thinking, is that kind of part of your frame as kind of like, yeah, bringing it up to like visions of decarbonization and stuff, net zero and all?
So it is a challenge.
Yeah.
I originally conceived of it as a pre-deregulation. Right? Like that just feels like a different animal.
Yeah.
Right? But I think if I wanted to speak to the present, I'm going to have to somehow link those two things. But I think, again, for me, even if we leave aside the deregulation era after 78, like so much of that infrastructure is already in place, particularly in the regions that I'm talking about, some of the older fields. Yeah. So I think that it may not be necessary to go through there, but I am aware that is an increasingly gaping hole. That's the further away we get from 1960.
Classic problem. But you could handle the climate change stuff in an epilogue or something if you had to. So let me ask you a question about sources. Like the stuff you were looking at, I like how you're kind of like started with this thing in Pennsylvania, and then you're like, all right, I got to blow out in various ways. That makes sense. And I'll just mention, I don't know if you've read Connor Harrison's work, but I had a previous episode with him where he talked about his race and electrical infrastructure stuff. But like, I imagine if it's Hagley stuff, it's kind of like organizational archival materials, right? And so I wonder like where the workers are in that. Like some of it you can probably reconstruct. I heard you already doing it earlier, like the experience of working there and raises and stuff. But is there a way to kind of like get to the workers' perspective? I mean, do they have newspapers and stuff? I don't know. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I guess this has become a really complicated question. I took very much for granted my archive in my first book, and I've learned to never do that again. So I was writing about coal miners, and they all had they wrote a lot of stuff about themselves, and it was all in one place, and I could go look at it. And this really had nothing like that. And so I started with what I could get access to. So access has become a huge issue, actually.
Sure.
In terms of getting access to utility company records. The Pennsylvania Power and Light Company, their records were open, so I went there. And one of the challenges of having so little research done on this topic is that I had really basic questions that I had no way to answer, right? Like, how much do people get paid? Right? Yeah. Like, how long do they work for? How many days a week do they work? And when I was going through the time cards, I was like, okay, there are some really interesting things in here I don't know how to explain. Right, learning that these are lifer jobs, right? People generally work in the industry for a long time. Even that really basic organizational stuff has been really key to trying to answer some of those really key questions. And then beyond that, I've had to get kind of creative about how I'm getting at this. So one has been court depositions. That's been particularly useful for cases where employees are suing the company. And I found some really, really excellent ones, both from Detroit Edison and from Duke Power in North Carolina. I also have been trying to use census records, power company complaints that people file with state utility commissions, and then just basically any mention I can find of anything anywhere. So the utility workers, they do have a publication. And interestingly, right, there are some traces again in the, what is it? I'm totally blanking on what it's called. It has a punny name. But the CIO version of this union doesn't start until the 30s. And there's obviously union activity that's happening before that, mostly with the IBEW. And, but that is, again, because it has this very trade outlook, there's a lot that's getting left out. There are people who aren't being organized. And the other issue is that those publications are hyper-focused on a couple of regions where so they're hyper-focused on some areas of Eastern Michigan and also New York City. And so Pennsylvania becomes a target for the union, but it's not really the people there producing it. So yeah, I'm still in the process of collecting sources. I've had to get a little creative.
Yeah.
I'm hoping potentially, I mean, this is, again, the window on this even is closing, doing some oral histories.
Yeah.
I've also found other oral histories other people collected for different purposes. And so I guess this is actually another piece, is that there's nothing really written about utility workers as such, but they appear in a lot of other places.
Sure.
In different contexts. So like a really important example of this is the case Griggs versus Duke Power Company, which is known in civil rights law because it abolishes or it makes illegal tests that are not necessary for the job. Right? You can't like require someone to take a test that has nothing to do with how they would do their work. And there's a fair amount written on that case. It's very important legally, but nothing that really takes seriously, like it mattered that this was actually happening at a power plant in rural North Carolina, and is being brought by these 12 Black employees of the Duke Power Company. And so a lot of records for that case exist, but no one was particularly concerned about its integration into the power system. And so it's possible to kind of reread some of that stuff with a critical eye.
That's cool.
But again, it's sort of a piecemeal process, but it's really fun.
That's so cool. I mean, I love, that's like the really good historical stuff is when there's like been a lot written on something, but like you just do like a half degree perspectival shift and then you just see something new in it, right? Yeah. So I love it. I usually I don't like have people on when they're just starting something, but I got like I said, I just got so stoked by this project because I feel like when I was working on the innovation delusion and doing maintainer stuff, I wanted to write about electrical workers. And I just found there was like nothing, and I was like, how can this be? Like it just seems so important, and I think part of it is what I wanted to talk to you about next, which is I think that with the exceptions like people like Phil Scranton, I don't know if you've ever bumped into Phil's like 1990 or sometime like that article, like History of Technology and Labor History or something like that. But with a few exceptions, there was not a lot of history of technology that was labor history, right? Does that feel right to you? Yeah. And so, what I wanted to talk to you about, what we're heading towards, you have a book coming out in the fall that's also very cool. And so we're going to head towards talking about that. But I wanted to talk to you about like grad school and kind of, because before we got talking or before we got recording, you were saying you came into your the history program at University of Chicago thinking you were going to be a labor historian. And you still are a labor historian, right? But that was your road. And then how did you kind of end up getting into these technological systems and, as your kind of frame?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things whenever I hear people talk about this and they have like this really good path, and mine is definitely not like that. But, I have this thing I often talk about with students from Camilla Townsend's new book on Fifth Son. But she has this moment with her where she talks about like reading the sources until they talk back to you, right? And so... and I think this was like one of the moments that I had so I came in and I was like, I want to understand why union power declines in the 1970s, that I was kind of unsatisfied with the answer that I was seeing. And I was curious. I was like, I want to figure this out. And when I went into the archives of coal miners, I found that there was like a lot about environmental politics that I hadn't really thought about before. A lot about things like nuclear power, which I had never really, hadn't really crossed my mind as something worth thinking about. And so listening to my sources there made me incorporate systems thinking, which is a direct branch into history of technology and STS.
Oh, that's cool.
So to really develop kind of the vocabulary to talk about it, I had to get into it. And then I think at the end of the day, right, like you can't do justice to people's expertise in their working lives if you don't take seriously the kind of knowledge they have and the kind of work that they're doing. So like, giving myself a mini crash course in like electrical engineering, trying to understand how different kinds of machines work and things like that. I think, but for me, it's one of those things, once you're trained in a particular field, right? Like you look around and everything is everything is labor.
Oh, yeah. But
Right?
that's
And
true,
everywhere.
actually. That's just true.
It's true, but I think it could work for pretty much anything else too.
Yeah,
Of
yeah.
course, it's right when I say it. Yeah.
Um, uh, oh, what were you just saying? I'm sorry. I just lost my train of thought. Doesn't happen too often. Um, Systems thinking. Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask you about. That was a very interesting thing, like way to put it. And that's not something we teach in history programs very often, is it? I mean, so where'd you turn to start thinking in that way? Were you just reading engineering stuff? Yeah. How would you train it? Like, how would you start thinking about that?
Well, like we were saying before, my PhD advisor was Jim
Mm-hmm.
Sparrow. And when I was doing my orals reading, he had me actually reading a bunch of this stuff. So Thomas Hughes,
Yep.
Bill Selznick, right? He was having me read this sort of classic, more social science inflected
Yeah.
work. And so I think it was in the back of my head a little bit that there was something there. And then when I turned to this project, and again, it came down to like this idea that, again, this is like something I heard Vince Brown say once at a talk where he was like, I need the tools to see the thing in front of my face. And I was like, I need the tools that will allow me to see the thing that I'm looking at. The tools I have don't really work. And so it just, when I read, I think everyone does this, right? Where you're like reading through a book, you check a citation, you go get the other book. And suddenly you've got like this sort of chain of thinking.
Yeah.
And so one of my hopes actually with this project is I can go do a more systematic reading of that literature because it's super fascinating.
Yeah, totally. Are there any like kind of system thinkers that books or authors that you find like particularly moving or interesting?
So I'm terrible.
No,
with
me
names.
too, man. Don't worry about it. And if you're like, I'm blanking right now, it's fine.
But there's this one, like, so there's this book on Bowker and Starr.
Yeah, sure.
On problems. Yeah.
Their standards book.
Yeah. And then Michelle Murphy.
Okay.
So like those are sort of my two touchstones.
Nice.
Yeah.
And with Michelle Murphy, is it the care stuff, the troubling care piece?
So no, that's also great. I was thinking of the sick building syndrome.
Oh, of course. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's funny because of maintainer stuff. I would have been so kind of attached to that troubling care essay. But yeah, the sick building book is really good too. Well, very cool. So you got your kind of your like STS-y stuff is part of the picture for you. So did you got into this via labor, and you just told us about how kind of like you got into systems thinking, but there's also this energy part of it for you, and you're a like co-leader of something called the Energy Humanities Research Initiative. Is that true? You're part of something? And tell us a bit about that. And is Energy Humanities like an identity for you? Is that like, did you get into that? Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess there's two pieces here. One is like coming to the energy label. And then I guess maybe I'll start by just saying something about the Energy Humanities Research Initiative. So this is a collaboration between myself, and then my colleagues Farah Oruch and Vicky Gugassian. And we sort of have been trying to facilitate conversations that are both emerging from our work, but also go beyond us. And so, we've convened things on like, what does everyday energy mean? Ideas about affect, and sort of structures of feeling and energy systems. Cool. And now we're sort of pivoting towards rereading the decolonial canon through an energy lens. So that's like sort of another project here I have ongoing. It's, really fulfilling to be able to work with them, as well as my colleagues at Sears. But energy itself actually is, again, it goes back to this idea of like listening to the sources. Again, I had no way of thinking about this before I started that first project. And then I came across an editorial written by a reform movement newspaper in like 1969. And it was thinking about the problem of conglomeration. And so I had never really thought about like, where do energy companies come from, right? And then I realized, I was like, they actually had to sort of conceive of like, what is an energy industry? That it wasn't obvious that coal and oil and natural gas are actually like all the same thing, that it's a historical, and this again, now it's not from when I'm saying it out loud, but it had never occurred to me that this was like a historical process that ends with this being a thing. And so these miners write, you need to recognize you are not a coal miner, you are an energy worker. And on the one hand, it's this sort of radical departure where they're reimagining what unionism could mean. And so part of this is that they're saying they should bargain jointly with the oil, chemical, and atomic workers union. Never actually happens, but it's this very telling moment where they're understanding the changing structure of the industry that's particularly accompanied electric intensification in the middle of the 20th century. But then there's also this like underlying idea that they're able to make that leap, right? Because they are sort of they have this core idea of industrial unionism, right? Wall-to-wall industrialism. And so I think even the idea of an energy worker would have seemed very foreign, I think, in some ways at one moment, but the concept of what they were thinking about and what they were calling for was not. And once they said that, I started thinking about, that there's this boundary between energy as it moves through a system, and then a social or a political system. And then there's the fuels themselves that are all contributing to that. It became a really important both historical concept to historicize, as well as a category to think with. And so I do consider myself sort of part of the energy humanities broadly. And there's people also doing other work on this, like Kara Daggett's. Actually, I didn't realize she's your colleague. Yeah. At VT. But, her work sort of locating this in sort of thermodynamic science. But I think there's an alternative labor history version of this. So obviously, like their energy and work are very tied, but energy and labor has a slightly different origin story.
Yeah.
And so for me, like really trying to think about not just energy as a form of work or work as a form of energy, but also thinking about energy and work as being constitutive of each other in different sort of social and political regimes. And so for me, that's how it's become this really organizing concept for me, is that it's an object in the world that I don't want to take for granted as a historical fact, but rather to try and see how it's changing and moving over time.
That's so cool. Yeah, was it? I was just flashing back. What is that book called? Like The Human Motor or something like that?
Yeah, Rebenbach. That's also a fantastic book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
the Science of Energy book, which is also really great. But interestingly, all of them are talking about coal energy systems. Like, so all three of these books, they're amazing, like mind-blowingly good books. None of them talk about coal miners, right?
Yeah,
there's like all this coal and there's all this work, but never the work of producing coal. And I was like, what if this isn't, like, obviously we've all written books here now, so like we see how difficult it is. You can't do everything, whatever. I was like, what if this isn't just like we couldn't fit it into the book, but it's actually like a conceptual problem that has to be solved. And that's something I've been trying to think through. Yeah.
Say a bit more. Is the conceptual problem what you were just kind of outlining about? Yeah. What's the conceptual problem? Just to state it again.
Yeah. So I think that when you locate the origin, as Crosby and Daggett do, and Rebenbach to a lesser extent, in this sort of emergence of a scientific understanding.
Yeah. Okay. I got it. Right.
Yeah. And so I think there's it's a little bit of a standpoint epistemology problem, right? The people who are developing this idea, a totalizing idea of energy, are the very people who are maybe not thinking about how a unitary idea of energy is concealing this sort of multitude of different kinds of energies at the same time. And so to tell that story of the science of energy, you kind of have to leave the other one out because it doesn't really fit with it.
Well, I also think, I don't know, man, I'm writing an essay it's called Method in Technology Studies, and it's about doing materialist studies of human life with technology well. And part of the thing I talk about in there is it goes from what we can do without doing research, just on our butts, okay, which is like theorize, do phenomenology. There's things we can do, conceptual clarification work. Then it goes to what we can get out of other people's minds, like studying discourse, history of ideas, all this kind of stuff, Foucauldian stuff very often. And then finally, it's like how you study the material world and life with the material world. And part of the story I tell there is I think it has to do with the history of history and other fields, is that there's been a tendency because of the discourse analysis stuff and like kind of related schools of thought of getting stuck at the intellectual level, often with reference down to material stuff, but you're stuck in basically like elites' minds very often. And then like the workers, as an example of like, and the knowledge they have, the embodied knowledge they have and the movement of that knowledge and such, kind of like they're there maybe as objects of study from the elites, but not from the perspective that you're trying to get at. Am I making sense here?
Yeah, I think that 3-level sort of, I don't know if it's just a hierarchy, but I think the way you framed it is kind of like almost sort of a hierarchy of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
A really helpful way to sort of think through those divisions, because they're very clearly visible to me, but I didn't really have the vocabulary to talk about.
Well, I'm glad it resonates with you, but in this case, it's me who's learning from you. And I want to talk to your cool book coming out. So it's not very often that I talk to someone about a new project, and your new book, it's going to come out this fall. And I took the title from your webpage this morning, and I read some of the chapters. Is it still called Energy, Citizenship, Coal, and Democracy in the American Century? All right, cool. And tell us a bit about this. Like, if this is your elevator pitch moment. So if you're explaining to us, kind of non-academic stranger on a plane, what your book's about and what you were up to, lay it on us.
So it's a book about the relationship between coal miners and the rest of the country, right? And so basically getting people to see that what happens in coal country is not really a story just about coal country, but is really about the way that Americans relate to each other, and the way that we sort of decide on what the burdens and who will bear the burdens and benefits of the energy system. And so I look between 1880 and about 1980 to look at, the different ways that coal miners have left imprints on the country's laws and political imagination, and to think about the consequences of that for how we use, govern, and mobilize energy. And so for me, it's similar. It's in some ways a similar intellectual move where I'm saying, like, I'm going to think with coal miners. I'm going to take seriously their political activism, their labor activism as a form of political thought.
Yes.
And then try and sort of understand how they saw the world. And so for me, this has been, a pretty life-changing experience to really actually, it's totally changed how I see the world, to really take seriously that thread of thought over a long period of time and not just sort of take for granted sort of their contradictory relationship to coal, because fundamentally that was what it was about, right? It was a book about a contradiction, about this thing that is supposed to be simultaneously fueling democracy and yet inhibiting it at every turn. And so, how do you make sense of people who are both vociferously critical of that energy system and yet deeply invested in it? And so trying to take that contradiction seriously was sort of that project for me.
Just to make sure I'm clear in my head, they're inhibiting democracy because of their acting up and stuff and being disruptive, or?
Oh, no, the coal is inhibiting the democracy by killing people.
Okay. Yeah, well, yeah. Okay. I'm glad I asked. Yes. That's very different. And by the way, I just did it because I was a bum. I didn't even plan it, but I have my Madawan t-shirt on right now. I just rolled out of bed, and then I got here and was reading your book, and I was like, oh, this is very appropriate. I want to talk to you about energy citizenship as a concept in a minute, but you're writing about Appalachia, right? And so I thought you'd talk about this in the intro. I mean, did you get into Appalachian studies at all? I'm in Appalachia right now, by the way. I'm in Blacksburg. I'm up in the mountains. So yeah, I mean, how did you kind of, I don't know, maybe it was fresh for you? Was it new? How did you learn about Appalachia?
I mean, I lived there, so I'd moved around. And I spent a few years in different parts, mostly in this more southern belt, like in North Carolina. But I think the immediate thing to me was a recognition of this gap between representation and reality. Yeah. Right. And which I think is not going to surprise anyone from the region. But I think on the one hand, I am engaged in Appalachian studies insofar as that scholarship has produced invaluable work that I couldn't have written the book without. But at the same time, I really think that in some ways, I mean, not in some ways, in no way, this is not a book for Appalachian studies.
No. Right.
Well, and what I mean by that is that I don't really think much of it would be that surprising, right? And I think really what I'm doing is trying to take, again, this form of political activism and political thought that has been central to how politics in the region has unfolded, and making visible the consequences of that for the country as a whole, right? And so for me, like, it's about taking this thing that's often portrayed by scholars outside the region as being kind of marginal, right? As sort of being like something that's attendant, and really saying like, no, if you want to understand contemporary and modern American politics, you really need to understand what happened in this region and why. And that what happens in the region is not just regional politics.
Amen. I've been felt compelled to make the same move in my current book project, A Good History of Shit Jobs. So I'm writing a lot about the South Side of Chicago and, Youngstown, Ohio and California and stuff. But I've just, Appalachia is like very central to my story at this point. And so I'm making a kind of similar kind of move. I'm just trying to read. There's so much great work in Appalachian studies. So I'm trying to read and learn from it and then kind of build it into kind of the synthetic narrative that I'm putting together, I don't think, as you said, I don't think they're going to be surprised by anything I have to say in any way whatsoever, but they have so much to teach us. Yeah, so let's talk about energy citizenship, your concept here. Like what does the concept mean and what's it do for you?
So it started because I was very unsatisfied with the producer-consumer description of the relationship. So obviously people use the energy that coal produces and miners produce coal, but it didn't really describe the character of the relationship and the kinds of claims people were making on each other.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And so for me, like a book that I didn't know at the time would be this way because I read it as an undergrad, but which has been so foundational to me is Linda Kerber's No Right to Be Ladies.
Okay.
Which is all about the rights and obligations of citizenship. And as I was reading my sources, increasingly what I saw were people making very similar kinds of claims, specifically coal miners making claims the country owed them something because they had fulfilled a civic obligation. Right. And so they were using this language of citizenship, and I resisted it for a really long time because on the one hand, I was like, this really isn't a story that's only American. And I was worried that making it a story about citizenship would make it seem that way. And also because there was obviously a huge industrial and economic component. Right. And I didn't want to undermine that. But then at the end of the day, I had to listen to the sources, and the sources were screaming at me trying to say, this is a story about how people come to see energy as a form of obligation and how they come to see these obligations as a legitimate form, right? So it's not even just enough that coal miners say, you owe us something, but that the rest of the country agrees that their claim is a legitimate one, right? That recognition, and like it even happens at the level of the Supreme Court. And that actually, when I finally allowed myself to fully grasp the significance of that, I was like, oh, okay, this is actually really important. And so energy citizenship for me is a pair of words that give voice to, again, something miners never use that term specifically, but it's so core to everything they think about how to undertake political action, how they conceive of the relationship between them and large cities or suburbs. Right? It's all conceived of as a form of political relationship, not an economic one. And that becomes increasingly important, particularly after the New Deal.
Yeah. Well, that's so fascinating. I mean, it's funny because I feel like there's a lot of stuff in popular and smart culture about kind of energy geopolitics on a global scale. And I think you'd probably see this in older histories of coal strikes and stuff, that like the folks who were writing those histories realized that those same politics were happening internally. But the US is very blessed in quotation marks because of its energy wealth, basically, But I feel like part of what I'm learning from you is the invisibility of it. I mean, I think that's kind of a theme of your work, is like the unseen. And like the fact that we don't tell the coal workers' stories in the same way we tell stories about like wars in the Middle East or something. You know what I mean? Like somehow they're just not visible to us.
Yeah, I mean, I think core to that idea, right, is really recognizing that seeing is a political act,
totally.
right? And perception is political. And so learning to see or learning not to see is also, again, this product of similar histories. I think the other side of it, too, is that realistically, although there's much more written about geopolitics of energy, it is not written with the people who produce that.
Totally. I shouldn't. I hope I wasn't as like.
No, just in case anyone listening was confused.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like we are starting to have good stuff on minerals and labor, right? Whether it's like in Africa or in Latin America, there is good stuff on that. But I should have made that caveat. Most of the stuff focused on geopolitics does not include the laborers in the picture.
And again, like you were saying, there are people doing really good corrective work, but it's just still very lopsided. I think like my dream would be, and I think there were good reasons to tell this story as a national story. But I think there's another side of the story, which I think someone should write. I don't think I'm the person who's going to have the energy to go do that again. On the international side of it, right? Because there are really clear international connections that are being forged by miners. There's a whole story about coal export markets in the global Cold War. So there are a lot of other stories, I think, that would internationalize the story that are worth doing. But I think there was the reason to do it as this particular project as a national story is that you miss, I think, so much of labor history, right, takes that internationalist perspective or takes the sort of industrial perspective. And that's precisely why it's missed this bigger story about political belonging and how energy makes nation, right? Not just in a way of like the US has a lot of energy resources, which it does, but also that part of the way that the country has decided who is in and who is out is by the way they relate to each other through the energy system.
No, totally. Well, I mean, Trish, I love it. It's great. People should definitely check out the book when it comes out in the fall. You have so many fascinating chapters in there. And I feel like your electrical industry book, that's like that's going to be several years, probably, right? And you got this energy humanities project going. Tell us a bit about where that's headed, just to give people a sense of next steps. You said there was a third project underway, but yeah, go ahead and tell us where you're headed.
Yeah. So broadly speaking, we started with trying to do real interdisciplinary work that foregrounds like interdisciplinary conversation, not just like putting a bunch of stuff together from different disciplines and hoping that it works. We also were really interested in the problem of what does it mean to study energy from another oil state, right? And so we're located here.
All your colleagues are there in the Gulf. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so we're all here. We work in a place where the history of oil and the history of work works in really interesting ways. And we were interested in saying, energy studies, broadly speaking, is located in these North Atlantic institutions. And we're certainly at a branch campus of one of those, but we're all committed to our work here in place, right? Putting our work here in place. And so we're like, what does it mean to actually reorient that conversation away from these particular set of concerns and to think with and from the global South?
Yeah.
And so I had this moment. I always teach a film called oh my goodness, this is because it's the end of the day. This film called Concerning Violence. So I teach a film called Concerning Violence. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a archival documentary by Göran Olsson, who's a Swedish filmmaker. And so it's all composed with, I think, mostly film from the Swedish film archives or TV archives. And it's then narrated against the text of Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. And so it's sort of selected. You have Lauryn Hill narrating it, and then this archival footage. And there are a few particular sequences that sort of oriented me to this rereading of Fanon through an energy lens, sort of as an Anthropocene text. And so one was, the natural resources part is an obvious one, but even just the visuals that Olson uses in the film really lend themselves to that kind of rereading, thinking about landscape, thinking about energy, thinking about resources. Nice. And so we sort of had this idea of what if we took the decolonial and anti-colonial canon, and we reread it through the lens of the energy humanities, not just like looking for energy, like looking for fuels, etc., but really thinking about how different frameworks for thinking about energy in society can allow this canon of work to become useful in new ways.
That's cool.
And so that's sort of what we're thinking about now. And
yeah, I love it.
That's also
yeah, I think if you just read, if you read texts in the 20th century, the energy shows up. And I've learned a lot from this guy. I don't know if he graduated yet. His name's Gustav Lester. Have you met him yet?
No.
He's a historian. Came out, I think it's the history of science program at Harvard. And he's doing kind of like mineral humanities stuff. He's looking at kind of settler colonial stuff in the US and mineral repositories, basically. And yeah, I mean, just reading Jefferson's famous notes on the state of Virginia, or like notes on Virginia, whatever it's called, and it turns out there's minerals all over the place in that, some of which maybe some energy stuff too. But I think it's just a beautiful thing to think about how we can go back to all these texts with this kind of technological eyeballs on, and like just new stuff comes out, right? That's part of the project.
Well, I think one of the really exciting things in energy studies, particularly for the Americas, is rethinking about the plantation as an energy system, right? And so this is where like someone like Jefferson becomes also important again. And so, something that I think we need a really good narration of, and people have started to try and do this, like Ryan Cecil Jobson, but sort of narrating how ideologically the U.S. goes from an energy system organized around plantations, again, ideologically organized, not because obviously it's much more complex than that on the ground, to something that is sort of then organized around a set of mineral extractive zones linked by rail, right? And so that's like a pretty radical, if we think about the energy system as sort of fundamentally undergirding the political and social possibilities of it, and then also undergirding and also shaping them, like that is a pretty profound shift.
Yeah.
And it's not accidental that it happens when it does. And so I think like getting more fine-grained archival histories, more sort of reorientations to that, I think is, again, for me, is one of the most exciting things happening in energy studies. The settler colonial part also, I think, is a really big part of that. Robert Suits, I think, is doing some really exciting work on that.
That's very cool. Yeah, it reminds me, and this might connect to the stuff you did about affect or emotion too. There's this essay, I need to look at it again, it's been years, but it's a book chapter by David Nye called something like Energy Crisis as Cultural Crisis or something like that. I don't know if you've ever bumped into this thing. It was very important for my thinking, like coming out of grad school, because I think it was just like one of those things where I put on glasses where I saw all cultural practice as relying on energy flows in some way, whether it's going to the, driving to go canoeing or whatever, I mean, like it's all caught up with energy somehow. And, and then it just becomes kind of like you all are exploring, like our emotions are all tied up with this kind of stuff, and whether it's watching film or whatever, right? I mean, it's just, it is a kind of different way of looking at all human activity, I guess. Yeah.
Well, that's for me, I think, right, the payoff of something like a field in energy history, like if we need energy history as like a concept, right, is for me is it doesn't have that payoff of letting you see the world in a different way. And I still cling to the idea. I think it does. And I think, I'm glad you mentioned David Nye. It would be kind of wild to get through this whole conversation.
Well, good. Yeah, I love David is such a sweet man too. I don't know if you had a chance to meet him.
I've never had a chance to meet him, but similarly, right, like Electrifying America for me was just and that's probably the closest thing that exists to the kind of book I want to write. It's a very different kind of book, but it's probably the closest in terms of like the kind of approach he's able to take in the work that he does.
Yeah, and I even David Nye would do that book differently today than, but like it's so foundational for being able to think through these issues. The only other thing I want to say is I would be remiss. I don't know if you've met my buddy Ben Coders O'Brien yet, but he's a student at Columbia University. He's writing a history of the U.S. electrical energy fuel mix, from like the beginning to the present, looking at all the agglomeration of coal and hydro and nuclear stuff. So If you two haven't connected, you definitely should at some point. You guys would get a huge...
So I've run across him in different places, but I've never actually had the chance to
I'll
meet,
just
so
connect you two via email. You guys definitely have to be in touch. Well, Trish, this was wonderful. I'm very excited by your work, both the stuff coming down the pike and your new book. It's all really great, and I'm glad to know you and your colleagues are out there doing this wonderful stuff.
Well, thank you so much again for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at sts_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.